Stay strong. We are here.
For a million years ago, long before cities, languages, or even fire, life was raw and unforgiving. The world was wild, ruled not by humans but by predators and survival itself. In the heart of East Africa's vast savannas, early hominids, our distant ancestors, were just beginning their fragile journey toward becoming human. They were not kings of their world. They were prey, scavengers, and survivors in a land filled with teeth and claws. This is their story. The hominids of this age were small, barely more than 1.5 meters tall. They walked upright, though their gait was awkward and unsteady compared to modern humans. Their bodies were lean, their arms still long and powerful for climbing trees, their faces primitive but filled with curiosity and fear. Their craniums were small, housing brains no larger than those of modern chimpanzees. Yet within those modest minds flickered something extraordinary. The capacity for learning, for memory, for the first glimmers of what will become human consciousness. Their hands were remarkable instruments of survival, capable of both delicate manipulation and powerful gripping. Fingers that could pluck berries from thorny bushes could also fashion crude tools from stone and wood. Their feet, still bearing traces of their arboreal ancestry, were adapting to the demands of terrestrial life. Each step across the savannah was a testament to evolution in progress, a species caught between the safety of the trees and the opportunities of the open ground. Every sunrise was the beginning of a battle. Food, water, and safety were never guaranteed. Life depended on alert eyes and quick instincts. Before we continue with this video, kindly comment which country you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The keen ability to distinguish between the rustle of wind through grass and the stealthy approach of a predator often meant the difference between seeing another sunset or becoming a meal. Their senses were finely tuned to their environment. Ears that could detect the subtlest sounds, eyes that could spot movement across vast distances, noses that could identify the scent of water from miles away, or the musk of a dangerous carnivore lurking nearby. The savannah was both a home and a battlefield. Lions roamed the tall grass, their golden coats blending perfectly with the dried vegetation. These apex predators were larger than their modern descendants, with males weighing up to 300 kilograms and possessing the strength to bring down prey 3 times their size. Saber-toothed cats lurked in shadows, their elongated canines capable of delivering devastating wounds with a single strike. These prehistoric killers were patient hunters, capable of waiting motionless for hours before unleashing their deadly assault. Hyenas laughed in the night, eager for weakness. But these were not the relatively modest hyenas of today. They were giants, some species standing as tall as modern lions and possessing bone-crushing jaws that could shatter the femur of an elephant. They hunted in packs of 20 or more, coordinating their attacks with an intelligence that rivaled that of their hominid prey. And yet, the greatest struggles were often not with predators, but with the environment itself: heat, drought, hunger, and the constant threat of injury or disease in a world without medicine or shelter. The climate was volatile and unpredictable. Seasonal rains could transform a landscape overnight, turning dusty plains into rushing torrents that swept away the unwary. When the rains failed, as they often did for months at a time, the land became a furnace. Surface temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, and finding shade became as crucial as finding water. The hominids learned to read the sky, to recognize the subtle signs that preceded weather changes, developing an intimate understanding of their environment that modern humans can barely comprehend. To survive, hominids traveled in small bands of 15 to 30 individuals. Each group was a complex social unit bound together by kinship, necessity, and the shared experience of constant danger. They developed crude forms of communication, gestures, grunts, and primitive vocalizations that conveyed essential information about food sources, dangers, and group movements. Leadership was fluid, often determined by the immediate needs of the situation rather than rigid hierarchies. Each group depended on one another in ways that went far beyond simple cooperation. Sharing food was not merely generosity, but essential survival strategy. A successful hunt or the discovery of a rich feeding ground meant life for the entire band. They developed complex social bonds, caring for the injured, protecting the weak, and maintaining the group's cohesion even under the most extreme stress. Alone, they stood little chance against the myriad threats of their world. Together, they had the faint beginnings of what would one day become human society. The elderly members of these groups, though rare due to the harsh conditions, were treasure repositories of knowledge. They remembered the locations of seasonal water sources, the behavior patterns of predators, the subtle environmental cues that preceded natural disasters. Their experience was a collective memory of the group, passed down through observation and crude instruction to younger members who would carry this vital information forward. Child rearing was a community endeavor. Mothers bore the primary responsibility for infants, but the entire group participated in their protection and education. Children learned through constant observation and imitation, developing the skills necessary for survival from their earliest moments. Play was not mere entertainment, but training for the deadly serious business of staying alive in a hostile world. One late afternoon, as the sun burned low over the horizon, painting the savannah in shades of gold and crimson, a group of hominids gathered near a dry riverbed. The seasonal rains were still months away, and the once flowing water had been reduced to scattered pools of increasingly brackish liquid. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the baked earth, and the acrid smell of drought filled their nostrils. Among them was a strong male with a scar across his chest, a jagged reminder of an encounter with a young leopard 3 seasons prior. The wound had nearly killed him, becoming infected and fevering him for weeks while the group nursed him back to health. Now fully recovered, he bore the mark as a badge of survival, proof that it faced death and emerged victorious. His name, in the limited vocalizations of his people, meant survivor, and he had earned it through countless trials. Beside him moved a heavily pregnant female, her swollen belly making her gait even more awkward than usual. She was perhaps 7 months along, and the entire group was protective of her condition. Pregnancy in this harsh world was fraught with danger. The additional nutritional requirements, the decreased mobility, the vulnerability during birth. Many pregnancies ended in tragedy, and every successful birth was celebrated as a victory against the odds. The group was foraging for roots and small animals, their movements coordinated through years of practice. Some members used digging sticks to excavate tubers from the hard-packed earth, while others searched for insects, grubs, and small lizards that provided essential protein. Their diet was incredibly diverse, including everything from termites to bird eggs, from wild berries to the occasional piece of carrion scavenged from a predator's kill. They had learned to identify dozens of edible plants, understanding which parts were safe to consume and which were poisonous. The knowledge of seasonal availability was crucial, knowing when certain fruits ripened, when particular roots were most nutritious, when insect larvae were fattest and most abundant. This botanical expertise, accumulated over generations, represented one of humanity's earliest forms of scientific knowledge. The riverbed offered particular promise. Even in drought conditions, certain areas retained moisture beneath the surface, creating microenvironments where plant life persisted. The hominids had learned to identify these spots, recognizing the subtle visual cues that indicated subsurface water. Here, they could find not only plant foods, but also the small animals that depended on these oases for survival. Unaware that danger was already coiled nearby, they worked methodically through the afternoon heat. The group maintained constant vigilance even during foraging, with designated individuals serving as lookouts while others focused on food gathering. Communication was continuous but subtle, soft clicks and whistles that conveyed information without attracting unwanted attention. Beneath a fallen log, partially buried by seasons of accumulated debris, a giant python lay in wait. This was no ordinary serpent, but a prehistoric monster, a species that evolved alongside the early mammals and had learned to see them as preferred prey. Its scales shimmered in the dim light, each one the size of a human thumbnail, creating a pattern that blended seamlessly with the dusty earth and dried vegetation. At nearly 7 meters long and weighing more than 80 kilograms, it was a silent killer that had perfected the art of ambush hunting over millions of years of evolution. Unlike the explosive predators like lions or leopards that relied on speed and power, the python was a patient assassin. It could remain motionless for days if necessary, its metabolism slowing to conserve energy while it waited for the perfect opportunity. The snake's heat-sensing organs could detect the warm-blooded signatures of its prey from considerable distances. It had been tracking this group of hominids for most of the day, following their progress along the riverbed and positioning itself at a likely convergence point. The python's intelligence was limited but effective. It understood patterns, recognized behaviors, and could anticipate the movements of its prey with remarkable accuracy. Its body was a marvel of evolutionary engineering. Hundreds of powerful muscles worked in coordination, capable of exerting crushing force that could snap bones and compress lungs until breathing became impossible. The snake's jaw could unhinge to swallow prey much larger than it had, and its backward curved teeth were designed to prevent escape once a grip was established. The male hominid, following a promising scent trail, bent to dig at a promising root with a sharpened stick. His tool was crude but effective, hardened in fire and shaped with stone implements into a point capable of penetrating the tough ground. As he worked, focused on his task and trusting in the group's collective vigilance, his hand brushed against the apparently harmless fallen log. The contact was gentle, barely a touch, but it was enough to trigger the python's strike mechanism. Millions of years of predatory instinct compressed into a single explosive moment. In an instant, the python struck with a speed that defied its size. Its massive head shot forward like a projectile, covering nearly 2 meters in the blink of an eye. Its jaws clamped around a hominid's arm with bone-crushing force, the needle-sharp teeth penetrating skin and muscle to establish an unbreakable grip. Before the male could even process what was happening, the snake's coils exploded outward like living ropes, wrapping around his torso and legs with devastating efficiency. The band screamed in alarm, their foraging forgotten in the face of immediate mortal danger. The sounds they made were primal expressions of terror and rage, vocalizations that communicated urgent threat to every member of the group. These weren't the calculated cries of modern humans, but raw emotional releases that conveyed information on a visceral level. As the snake wrapped tighter, its strength became apparent. Each coil was like a band of living steel, tightening with every breath the victim took until breathing itself became increasingly difficult. The python's technique was perfected through eons of evolution. It didn't need to inject venom or deliver a killing bite. It simply squeezed, applying pressure with mathematical precision until its prey could no longer draw breath. The male's cries echoed across the savannah, raw and desperate sounds that spoke of pain, terror, and the fundamental will to survive. His free arm flailed frantically, trying to strike at the snake's head or pry at its coils, but the python's position was too advantageous. Every movement the hominid made only served to trigger tighter constriction. The pregnant female froze momentarily, torn between terror and the instinct to protect her companion. Her condition made her vulnerable, and fleeing would have been the rational choice for her and her unborn child. Yet the bonds that held the group together were stronger than individual self-preservation. The male was not just a group member, but potentially the father of a child, a provider and protector whose loss would diminish the entire band's chances of survival. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, it seemed the python would claim its meal. The snake's eyes, cold and reptilian, showed no emotion, no malice, only the ancient imperative of hunger and survival. This was nature at its most fundamental, predator and prey locked in a struggle that had played out countless times across the millennia. But this was not the end. Hominids were not built for individual strength against such formidable beasts, but they possessed something even more powerful: the ability to coordinate, to think collectively, to transform individual weakness into group strength. This capacity for cooperation would eventually become one of humanity's greatest advantages, the foundation upon which civilizations would be built. Within seconds, it felt like hours. Other members of the group rushed forward, abandoning their individual safety for collective action. Some carried stones they had been using as tools. Others wielded the same sharpened sticks they had been using for foraging. These crude implements, barely more than shaped wood and rock, became weapons in the hands of desperate defenders. They circled the python like a pack of wolves, their individual terror transformed into focused aggression. Their shrieks and cries pierced the air, creating a cacophony of sound that served multiple purposes, intimidating the predator, coordinating their attack, and releasing the adrenaline-fueled energy that made desperate action possible. One hominid, a young female known for her climbing ability, leapt onto the snake's back near its midsection. The python's scales were smooth and difficult to grip, but she managed to maintain her position through sheer determination. Her stone tool, a chunk of basalt napped to a crude edge, rose and fell repeatedly as she pounded at the snake's muscular body. Another group member, an older male with experience in tool use, jabbed systematically at the snake's coils with his digging stick. He aimed for the spaces between scales, seeking to penetrate the python's armored hide and cause enough pain to force it to release its grip. His movements were calculated rather than frenzied, the result of a lifetime spent using tools for survival. The pregnant female, overcoming her initial paralysis, struck at the python's head with a branch she had grabbed from the ground. Despite her condition, she moved with surprising agility, her maternal instincts and group loyalty overriding personal safety. Her blows were less powerful than those of her male companions, but they were precisely aimed at the snake's most vulnerable points, its eyes and the sensitive scales around its mouth. The python hissed and thrashed, its massive body writhing as it attempted to defend itself while maintaining its death grip on its intended prey. The sound was unlike anything in the modern world, a prehistoric expression of rage and pain that reverberated across the savannah. Its tail lashed violently, capable of breaking bones with a single strike, forcing the attacking hominids to remain constantly mobile to avoid retaliation. Dust filled the air as the struggle raged, kicked up by the combatants' feet and the snake's powerful movements. The fine particles caught the late afternoon light, creating a haze that made the battle seem dreamlike and surreal. But there was nothing dreamlike about the stakes. This was a fight to the death, with the survival of not just one individual, but potentially the entire group hanging in the balance. The fight lasted only minutes, but felt like hours to the participants. Time seemed distorted by adrenaline and desperation, each second stretching as the hominids fought against their ancestral enemy. The male's face turned pale as the python's coils tightened, his breath becoming shallow and labored as the snake's grip compressed his chest. Yet the group refused to surrender. This refusal to abandon a group member in the face of overwhelming odds was perhaps the most human thing about these early ancestors. It spoke to a moral capacity that transcended simple survival instinct, a recognition that individual lives had value beyond their immediate utility to the group. Blow after blow rained down on the python's body, each strike guided by growing understanding of the creature's anatomy and vulnerabilities. The hominids learned as they fought, adapting their tactics in real time as they discovered which attacks were effective and which were merely wasted energy. This ability to learn and adapt in crisis situations was another crucial component of early human intelligence. The snake's grip began to weaken as pain and exhaustion took their toll. Its prehistoric brain, designed for ambush and overwhelming force rather than prolonged combat, struggled to process the coordinated attack it faced. This was not how its encounters with prey were supposed to unfold, and its limited cognitive capacity left it ill-equipped to adapt to the changing circumstances. At last, after what seemed an eternity of struggle, the python's coils loosened perceptibly. The critical moment came when the young female on its back managed to drive her stone tool deep into the soft tissue behind the snake's skull. The blow was not fatal, but it was devastating enough to disrupt the python's nervous system and force it to reassess the situation. With one final coordinated strike, multiple hominids attacking simultaneously at the snake's head, the beast finally released its victim. The python's survival instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution, overrode its hunger. Badly wounded and facing multiple determined attackers, it chose retreat over persistence. The great serpent slid back into the underbrush with surprising speed for such a massive creature, leaving a trail of disturbed vegetation and its own blood in the dust. It was wounded but alive, and it would remember this encounter. The lesson would influence its future hunting decisions, adding the collective behavior of hominids to its catalog of threats to be avoided. The male collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as his compressed lungs fought to refill. His ribs were bruised, perhaps broken, and his arm bore deep puncture wounds from the python's teeth. Purple bruises were already forming where the snake's coils had compressed his torso, and he would carry these marks for the rest of his life. But he lived, and because he lived, the group lived. His survival meant that his knowledge, his strength, and his genetic contribution to the group's future remained intact. In the harsh calculus of prehistoric survival, this represented a victory of immeasurable importance. The aftermath of the attack revealed much about these early hominids' capacity for care and cooperation. Without modern medical knowledge or supplies, they tended to their injured member with remarkable intuition and dedication. They fashioned crude bandages from plant materials, cleaned his wounds with water from their precious supply, and created a stretcher from branches and animal hide to transport him safely. This was the reality of survival. Victory was not triumph, but endurance. Every day one meant another chance at life, another opportunity to learn and adapt, another step along the long path that would eventually lead to human civilization. The concept of heroism in a modern sense didn't exist for these early ancestors, but their actions demonstrated a heroism of a different kind. The quiet courage of beings who refused to surrender to a hostile world. This was only one of countless battles these hominids faced. Each day brought new challenges, new threats, new tests of their adaptability and resilience. The Python attack, dramatic though it was, represented just one moment in an endless struggle for survival that defined every aspect of their existence. Food was perpetually scarce, requiring constant vigilance and endless searching. They scavenged carcasses left behind by the great predators, arriving at kill sites to compete with hyenas, vultures, and other scavengers for the remaining scraps. This dangerous activity required careful timing and coordination, arriving too early meant confronting predators still defending their kill, while arriving too late meant finding nothing but picked clean bones. They learned to read the signs of recent predator activity, distinguishing between the tracks and scents of different species, to determine when it was safe to approach a carcass. Lions typically gorged themselves and then rested, creating windows of opportunity. Leopards often cached their kills in trees, making them inaccessible but also indicating that the predator would return. Hyenas rarely left anything behind but could be driven off by a determined group if the potential reward was great enough. When they found meat, they gnawed on bones to reach the nutritious marrow inside, using their growing understanding of tool use to crack open the larger bones with rocks. This protein source was crucial for brain development and overall health, but it came with significant risks. Competing with other scavengers often led to injuries, and the meat itself could carry diseases or parasites that their digestive systems struggled to handle. Plant foods formed the majority of their diet, and they became expert botanists by necessity. They dug tubers from the earth with increasing sophistication, learning to identify the most productive areas and the optimal timing for harvest. Their digging sticks evolved from simple pointed branches to more complex tools, shaped and hardened through techniques that represented some of humanity's earliest technology. They cracked nuts with stones, developing the hand-eye coordination and tool selection skills that would eventually lead to more advanced technologies. Not all stones were suitable for nut cracking. They needed to be hard enough to break shells without being so heavy as to be unwieldy, and shaped in ways that provided good grip and striking surfaces. The ability to evaluate and select appropriate tools represented a significant cognitive advancement. The seasonal cycle dictated much of their behavior and movement patterns. They learned to anticipate the fruiting times of different plants, the migration patterns of animals, and the availability of water sources. This environmental knowledge was crucial for survival and was passed down through the generations as part of their growing cultural inheritance. At night, fire was not yet theirs to command. The controlled use of fire would not appear for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving these early hominids vulnerable to the many dangers that prowled in darkness. Instead, they relied on trees for safety, climbing high into branches where their arboreal adaptations still served them well. The nightly climb to safety was a carefully choreographed activity. The group needed to select trees that were tall enough to provide protection, but with branches strong enough to support their weight. They looked for trees with multiple escape routes, branches that connected to neighboring trees, or provided multiple pathways to the ground in case of emergency. Mothers clutched infants close as they settled into the branches for the night, using strips of plant fiber or animal hide to secure their babies to their bodies. The smallest children were the most vulnerable, lacking the strength and coordination to maintain their grip if they fell asleep. Losing a child to a nighttime fall was a constant fear that haunted every parent. Below them, glowing eyes circled in the darkness, the reflected light from nocturnal predators hunting in the moonlight. The hominids could identify different species by the height, spacing, and color of their eyes. Lions' eyes appeared as golden orbs set relatively high and far apart. Leopards showed as smaller, closer-set lights that move with feline grace. Hyenas displayed as multiple sets of eyes moving in coordination, their pack-hunting behavior evident even in the darkness. Sleep came in short bursts, always broken by fear and the need for vigilance. The group took turns maintaining watch, with the most alert individuals staying awake, while others dozed fitfully. Even sleep was a learned skill in this dangerous world. Sleeping too deeply could mean death, but insufficient rest led to the kind of mistakes that proved equally fatal. The sounds of the night created a complex audio landscape that the hominids learned to interpret with remarkable precision. They could distinguish between the normal sounds of nocturnal animal activity and the subtle audio cues that indicated approaching danger. The sudden silence of insects often warned of a predator's approach. Changes in the calls of night birds could indicate the presence of a large carnivore moving through the area. Wind patterns carried scent information across great distances, and the hominid sense of smell, though not as acute as that of many other mammals, was still far superior to that of modern humans. They could detect the musk of large predators, the scent of water or food sources, and even the emotional states of other group members through pheromone detection. Droughts stretched for weeks and sometimes months, testing the group's endurance and knowledge of their environment to the limit. Water holes dried up in predictable sequences, and the hominids learned to anticipate these patterns, planning their movements to stay ahead of the advancing drought. However, climate variability meant that these patterns weren't always reliable, and groups sometimes found themselves in desperate situations with no obvious water source nearby. When the rains failed, bands of hominids wandered miles across increasingly harsh terrain in search of sustenance. These journeys were epic tests of endurance and navigation ability. The group had to balance the energy expenditure of travel against the diminishing caloric returns from the depleted environment they were leaving behind. Navigation across the vast savannah required sophisticated spatial reasoning and memory. The hominids learned to use celestial cues, landmark recognition, and even subtle variations in vegetation patterns to maintain their sense of direction. They developed mental maps of their territory that included not just geography, but also seasonal variations in resource availability. Some groups did not survive these drought migrations. The weakest members, the very young, the old, and the injured, often succumbed to the combination of dehydration, malnutrition, and exhaustion. The decision of when to abandon a failing area was crucial and often meant the difference between group survival and extinction. Leaving too early meant abandoning potentially viable resources. Leaving too late meant attempting travel when the group was already weakened beyond recovery. For every victory against an animal predator, hunger claimed twice as many lives. Starvation was a constant presence, always lurking at the edges of awareness. The hominids learned to recognize the stages of hunger in themselves and others, understanding when someone was approaching the point of no return and needed priority access to any food found. Malnutrition affected not just survival, but also reproduction and child development. Malnourished females were less likely to conceive, more likely to miscarry, and more likely to die in childbirth. Children born during periods of severe food shortage often suffered developmental problems that affected them throughout their lives. The group's nutritional status thus had implications that extended far into the future. And yet, despite all odds they endured, this endurance was not passive but active, a constant process of adaptation, learning, and problem-solving that pushed the boundaries of what was possible for early hominids. Every challenge overcome made them slightly more capable of handling the next crisis. Every lesson learned became part of the group's collective knowledge, increasing their chances of long-term survival. What made these early hominids remarkable was not their strength, nor their size, but their ability to adapt. This adaptability operated on multiple levels. Physical adaptation to their environment, behavioral adaptation to changing circumstances, and cognitive adaptation that allowed them to learn from experience and apply that learning to new situations. They watched their environment with the intensity of beings whose lives depended on understanding every detail of their surroundings. They learned to recognize the subtle signs that preceded changes in weather, the behavioral patterns that indicated predator presence, and the environmental cues that reveal food or water sources. Most importantly, they remembered. Unlike most other species, which relied primarily on instinctual responses to environmental challenges, the hominids developed increasingly sophisticated memory systems that allowed them to accumulate knowledge over time. Individual experiences became group knowledge through primitive forms of communication and teaching. Each encounter with danger taught them new ways to survive. The python attack was not just a fight for one life. It was a lesson for all, a piece of information that would be remembered and passed down to future generations. They discovered the power of coordinated action, the effectiveness of tools as weapons, and the importance of refusing to abandon group members in crisis situations. These discoveries were the first flickers of what would one day become human intelligence. The ability to transform individual experiences into collective knowledge, to use tools not just as aids to survival but as extensions of physical capability, and to maintain social bonds that prioritize group welfare over individual safety. Though they did not know it, their struggle that day was part of a much larger journey. The journey of evolution that would eventually lead to the emergence of modern humans. Over the next 4 million years, their descendants would undergo remarkable transformations, developing larger brains, more sophisticated tools, complex languages, and eventually the ability to reshape their environment rather than simply adapting to it. But the foundations of all these future achievements were being laid in these desperate daily struggles for survival. The cognitive abilities that would eventually produce art, science, and philosophy were being forged in the crucible of predator avoidance, food gathering, and group cooperation. The social structures that would eventually support complex civilizations were emerging from the basic need to work together for survival. The technological innovations that would eventually lead to agriculture, industry, and space exploration had their origins in the simple necessity of fashioning tools to dig roots and defend against predators. When we look back across the vast expanse of time that separates us from these early ancestors, it is easy to forget how fragile the beginning was. The comforts of the modern world, abundant food, secure shelter, medical care, protection from predators, were unimaginable luxuries to these early hominids. Every convenience we take for granted represents the culmination of millions of years of struggle and innovation. Yet, without these early ancestors, without their courage, their pain, their endless fight against a hostile nature, none of the subsequent human story would have been possible. Every scar carried by these prehistoric survivors was a step forward in the long journey toward humanity. Every battle fought, whether against hunger, predators, or the giant python in the dust of that ancient riverbed, was a chapter in the epic story of human evolution. 4 million years ago, they were not yet human in the modern sense. Their brains were small, their technology primitive, their social structures basic. But they possessed something that set them apart from all other species. The capacity to grow beyond their limitations, to learn from their experiences, and to pass that learning on to future generations. They were becoming human. Slowly, painfully, through countless struggles and countless small victories, they were lighting the first sparks of fire that would eventually illuminate the world. Each day survived, each challenge overcome, each lesson learned was another step along the path that would lead, eventually, to us. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.